In the remote wilderness of Maine, 3 women operated what appeared to be a religious sanctuary for over 30 years. 600 women entered seeking spiritual healing. Fewer than half ever returned home. Those who did came back, changed. The Maine State Archives contain testimony from one survivor that was so disturbing, authorities refused to make it public for over a century. Tonight, we reveal what really happened behind the stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears. Before we continue with the story of the Convent of Eternal Tears, this channel isn't for everyone. Only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the darkest chapters of American history. If you have the courage to hear what really happened in the shadows of our past, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. Are you brave enough to join our community of true mystery seekers? Let's find out together. What makes this story particularly chilling is that it wasn't driven by religious fanaticism or supernatural forces, but by something far more terrifying. The calculated pursuit of knowledge at any human cost, hidden behind a facade of Christian charity. In the late 18th century, the District of Maine was still part of Massachusetts, a wilderness territory where isolated communities struggled to survive harsh winters and even harsher realities. The coastal town of Millbridge, population barely 300 souls, served as a trading post for lumber merchants and fishermen brave enough to navigate the treacherous waters of the Atlantic. 15 miles inland, through dense forest, marked only by Native American hunting trails, lay a parcel of land that would become synonymous with unspeakable horrors. The Ashford women arrived in Millbridge on a grey October morning in 1798. Their horse-drawn wagon loaded with mysterious crates and medical supplies that drew curious glances from townspeople. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford stepped down from the wagon with the bearing of European nobility. A striking woman in her early 40s with silver-streaked auburn hair and penetrating grey eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of her surroundings. Her voice carried the refined accent of educated English society, and her manner suggested someone accustomed to command and absolute obedience. Sister Prudence Ashford emerged next, a tall, gaunt woman of 30 with alabaster skin and hands that moved with the precise grace of a master craftsman. Her fingers were long and pale, with an unusual steadiness that would later prove essential to her gruesome work. Unlike her superior, Prudence spoke little, observing the world through pale blue eyes that revealed nothing of her thoughts. When she did speak, her voice held traces of a Scottish accent, cultured but with an underlying coldness that made even hardened frontiersmen uncomfortable. The youngest of the trio, novice Temperance Ashford, appeared to be barely past 22 years. She possessed a haunting beauty that drew immediate attention. Raven black hair, porcelain skin, and dark eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets. But there was something unsettling about her beauty, a quality that made mothers instinctively pull their children closer when she passed. Her smile never reached her eyes, and she had an unnerving habit of studying people as if they were specimens in a collection. The Ashford women claimed to be Anglican nuns fleeing religious persecution in England, seeking to establish a new order in the American wilderness. They carried impressive letters of recommendation from English church officials, documents that would later be revealed as masterful forgeries. Their story was compelling enough to satisfy the Protestant community of Millbridge, who viewed the presence of educated religious women as a civilizing influence on their rough frontier settlement. With gold coins that seemed inexhaustible, the sisters purchased nearly 200 acres of remote forest land from a grateful widow who had struggled to pay her late husband's debts. The price they paid, 3 times the land's assessed value, raised eyebrows, but also ensured enthusiastic cooperation from local authorities. They immediately hired every available carpenter, mason, and laborer in the region to construct their religious retreat. The building that rose from the wilderness over the following 8 months was unlike any religious structure the workers had ever seen. 3 stories of grey stone quarried from the nearby coast, with walls thick enough to muffle any sound from within. The windows were unusually small and positioned high on the walls, making it impossible to see inside from ground level. Most peculiar was the basement level, which required extensive excavation and reinforced foundations far beyond what would be needed for simple storage. When questioned about the unusual architecture, Mother Superior Agatha explained with a serene smile that penitence requires solitude, and solitude requires proper containment. Our sisters in England have learned that spiritual healing is most effective when the penitent is completely removed from worldly distractions. The explanation satisfied most listeners, though some of the older workers privately wondered why a house of God needed to look so much like a fortress. The Ashford women supervised every detail of construction with meticulous attention. They insisted on specific modifications that seemed strange to the builders: reinforced doors with heavy locks, drainage systems that could handle large volumes of liquid, and ventilation shafts that seemed more appropriate for a medical facility than a convent. When workers asked about these features, the sisters cited their experience with similar religious institutions in Europe, claiming these were standard accommodations for intensive spiritual counseling. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the circuit physician who traveled between frontier settlements, became one of the sisters' earliest and most enthusiastic supporters. A man in his 50s with a reputation for progressive medical thinking, Dr. Hartwell was immediately impressed by the sisters' apparent knowledge of feminine psychology and mental disorders. During their first meeting, he was amazed by their sophisticated understanding of conditions that most physicians barely recognized. The sisters possess remarkable insight into the nature of feminine hysteria and melancholia, he wrote in his journal. Their methods, while unconventional, are based on sound medical principles that I fear are decades ahead of current American practice. They speak of techniques for addressing the root causes of mental disturbance rather than merely treating symptoms. What Dr. Hartwell didn't record in his official journal was the private conversation he had with Mother Superior Agatha about the financial arrangements for their collaboration. In exchange for referring difficult cases to the convent and providing medical supplies through his connections, Dr. Hartwell would receive a substantial monthly payment and access to detailed case studies that could advance his own medical career. For a physician struggling to make a living on the frontier, it was an offer too valuable to refuse. The convent's reputation spread throughout the territory with remarkable speed. Families from settlements as far as Portsmouth, Portland, and even Boston began hearing whispered recommendations about the Ashford sisters' miraculous ability to transform troublesome women into model citizens. The cost was steep: $20 silver for a month's treatment, $50 for 3 months, and $100 for what they called complete reformation. But for desperate families dealing with scandalous daughters or hysterical wives, it seemed a small price to pay for peace and respectability. The types of women sent to the Convent of Eternal Tears reflected the social anxieties of early 19th century America. Unmarried mothers who refused to reveal their lovers' identities arrived alongside wives who had publicly challenged their husband's authority. Daughters who rejected arranged marriages were delivered to the same institution that received women who had shown too much interest in books or politics. The common thread was defiance. Women who had somehow stepped outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable feminine behavior. Religious tensions of the era also played a role in the convent's clientele. Puritan families occasionally sent daughters who had shown interest in Anglican or Methodist teachings, while Anglican families disposed of daughters attracted to the emotional fervor of Baptist revival meetings. The Ashford sisters accepted all denominations with equal enthusiasm, claiming their methods transcended sectarian differences through the universal power of Christian discipline. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong at the Convent of Eternal Tears came on a bitter February night in 1803, when young Thomas Brewster was hunting in the forest surrounding the mysterious institution. The 20-year-old trapper had been tracking a wounded deer for hours through the snow-laden wilderness when unusual sounds drew his attention toward the stone building that loomed dark against the winter sky. Thomas had grown up in these woods and knew every natural sound: the crack of ice-laden branches, the distant howl of wolves, the whisper of wind through pine needles. But what he heard that night was different, deeply wrong, and unmistakably human. Through the snow-heavy air came screaming that rose and fell in waves, sometimes dying to desperate whimpers before exploding again into raw, primal shrieks of agony that made his blood freeze in his veins. Abandoning his wounded prey, Thomas crept closer to the convent, his heart pounding as the terrible sounds continued. The building appeared completely dark from the outside, but as he circled toward the rear, he noticed a faint glow emanating from basement windows that were partially hidden by snowdrifts. The screaming grew louder as he approached, and with it came other sounds: the clink of metal instruments, urgent whispered conversations, and something that sounded disturbingly like sawing. Through a partially frosted basement window, Thomas glimpsed a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The basement had been converted into what could only be described as a surgical theater, brilliantly illuminated by dozens of oil lamps and candles that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. A woman was secured to a wooden table with leather restraints, her head held immobile by a metal apparatus that looked more like a torture device than medical equipment. Sister Prudence stood over the restrained woman, her usually pale face flushed with concentration, as she manipulated what appeared to be a long, thin metal rod. The patient's head had been partially shaved, revealing pale scalp marked with dark lines drawn in ink. Most horrifying of all, there was clearly an opening in the woman's skull. Thomas could see the gleam of exposed bone and something darker underneath that he realized with sick horror was brain tissue. The screaming woman's eyes were wide with terror and pain. But what made the scene even more nightmarish was the clinical detachment of her tormentors. Mother Superior Agatha stood nearby with a notebook, calmly recording observations as if she were documenting a routine medical procedure. Novice Temperance held additional instruments, passing them to Sister Prudence with the practiced efficiency of an experienced surgical assistant. Thomas watched in frozen horror as Sister Prudence inserted the metal rod deeper into the woman's skull. The screaming reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very stones of the building, then suddenly cut off as the patient lost consciousness. The sisters continued working with methodical precision, apparently untroubled by the fact that their patient was no longer responsive to their ministrations. Unable to witness anymore, Thomas fled into the night, stumbling through snowdrifts in blind panic. The image of that basement chamber burned itself into his memory. The casual efficiency of the procedures, the scientific detachment of the perpetrators, and most terrifying of all, the realization that this was clearly not the first time such horrors had occurred within those stone walls. When Thomas reached town the next morning, he burst into his father's blacksmith shop, babbling about torture chambers and brain surgery with such frantic intensity that his father feared the boy had suffered a mental breakdown. The elder Brewster, a practical man who valued community stability above all else, listened with growing alarm as his son described scenes that seemed to belong in Gothic novels rather than a respectable religious institution. "Thomas," his father said carefully, "you were hunting alone in a blizzard, in the dark, after tracking a wounded animal for hours. The mind can play terrible tricks under such circumstances. Perhaps what you saw was a medical procedure of some kind. The sisters are known to treat various feminine ailments that require intimate intervention." But Thomas's description was too detailed, too specific to be dismissed as hallucination or misunderstanding. He could describe the layout of the basement chamber, the specific instruments he had observed, and most convincingly, the clinical manner in which the procedures were being conducted. This wasn't the random violence of madness, but something far more sinister, systematic, methodical, and clearly practiced. The elder Brewster decided to consult with Deacon Morrison, the town's most respected citizen and unofficial moral authority. Morrison was a cautious man who had built his reputation on careful judgment and community harmony. The Ashford sisters had been model citizens for 5 years, contributing generously to local charities and maintaining perfect decorum in their rare public appearances. More importantly, several prominent families currently had daughters and wives receiving treatment at the convent. "We must be extremely careful," Deacon Morrison warned after hearing Thomas's account. "Accusations of this nature could destroy reputations and tear our community apart. These are respected women of God, not common criminals. There must be a reasonable explanation for what the boy thinks he saw." However, the deacon was too responsible to ignore such serious allegations entirely. He agreed to make a discreet inquiry, visiting the convent the following week under the pretense of discussing a church fundraising event that would require the sisters' participation. Mother Superior Agatha received him in the convent's austere parlor, a sparsely furnished room dominated by a large wooden crucifix and religious paintings that seemed to watch visitors with judgmental eyes. Her manner was perfectly gracious and composed, showing no sign of anxiety or guilt as she served tea and inquired about his family's health with apparent genuine concern. When Deacon Morrison delicately mentioned that local hunters had reported unusual noises coming from the convent at night, Mother Superior Agatha's expression showed only mild concern and understanding. "Deacon Morrison," she said in her cultured English accent, "we often conduct intensive prayer sessions for our most troubled residents during the quiet hours of night. The process of spiritual cleansing can be quite vocal, particularly for women who have lived lives of sin and moral corruption." She explained that many of their patients arrived in states of severe spiritual distress, possessed by demons of pride, lust, and rebellion that fought desperately against the purifying power of Christian discipline. "Some women," she continued with sympathetic sadness, "have allowed evil to take such deep root in their souls that the process of extraction requires considerable effort. The sounds your hunters heard were likely the cries of demons being cast out through the power of prayer and penance." The explanation was delivered with such sincerity and theological sophistication that Deacon Morrison found himself nodding in agreement. The concept of spiritual warfare was familiar to all frontier Christians, and the idea that particularly corrupted souls might require extreme measures for their salvation was not unreasonable within the religious context of the era. Mother Superior Agatha then offered to show him through the upper levels of the convent, leading him through Spartan but clean dormitory rooms, where several women sat in silent contemplation. The residents appeared calm and deeply absorbed in prayer or meditation, though Deacon Morrison noticed they seemed unusually subdued, moving with mechanical precision rather than natural human spontaneity. When he attempted to make eye contact with them, they seemed to look through him rather than at him, as if their attention was focused on something invisible in the distance. When the deacon asked about visiting the basement levels, Mother Superior Agatha explained that they served as the convent's intensive spiritual counseling facilities for women requiring the most focused attention. "I'm afraid it would be inappropriate for a man to witness such intimate procedures," she said with a modest smile. "Some of our treatments for feminine spiritual corruption require private examination of the soul that would compromise the patient's dignity if observed by male eyes." The explanation seemed reasonable within the social conventions of the time, and Deacon Morrison left the convent feeling reassured that Thomas Brewster had indeed misinterpreted what he had witnessed. However, something continued to trouble him during the ride home. A subtle wrongness that he couldn't quite identify, but couldn't shake from his thoughts. The women he had observed seemed too quiet, too controlled, moving with an unnatural uniformity that reminded him more of sleepwalkers than conscious human beings, and there had been a smell throughout the building that he couldn't quite place. Not just the expected odors of medicine and cleaning solutions, but something else underneath. Something that reminded him uncomfortably of the battlefield hospitals he had visited during the Revolutionary War, where the stench of blood and suffering had been so thick it seemed to coat the inside of his throat. Following Deacon Morrison's visit, the Ashford sisters implemented additional security measures that made their operations even more secretive. The loud screaming that had alerted Thomas Brewster was replaced by an eerie silence that somehow seemed more ominous than the previous nocturnal disturbances. Local families continued sending their troubled women to the convent, and the sisters continued accepting them with open arms and increasingly sophisticated promises of transformation. However, observant residents began noticing disturbing patterns that suggested something was fundamentally wrong with the treatments being administered. Behind those stone walls, women who entered the convent for spiritual correction often emerged months later as completely different people, not reformed or redeemed, but somehow fundamentally altered in ways that defied explanation. Mary Prescott had been a spirited, young woman of 19, known throughout Millbridge for her quick wit, infectious laughter, and stubborn independence that had scandalized her family by refusing 3 marriage proposals from suitable young men. Her parents, mortified by her public displays of willfulness, had finally sent her to the convent for 6 months of spiritual guidance to prepare her for proper married life. When Mary returned home, her parents were initially delighted by the transformation. Gone was the rebellious daughter who had argued about everything from household duties to religious doctrine. In her place was a docile, blank-eyed woman who spoke only when directly addressed and never expressed personal opinions or desires. She accepted the first marriage proposal that came her way with mechanical compliance, showing no emotion or preference about the match. But as weeks passed, Mary's parents grew increasingly concerned about their daughter's condition. She displayed no recognition of favorite foods, cherished possessions, or childhood friends. When shown letters she had written before her treatment, she stared at them without comprehension, as if looking at documents written by a complete stranger. Most disturbing of all, she showed no emotional reaction to anything. Neither joy nor sorrow, pleasure nor pain seemed to register in her consciousness. Dr. Hartwell, when consulted about Mary's condition, praised the sisters' work as a complete success. The patient has been cured of the mental defects that made her unsuitable for marriage and motherhood, he declared confidently. The rebellious spirit that caused her family such distress has been completely eliminated through proper spiritual discipline. However, Mary's mother noticed details that troubled her deeply. Her daughter bore unusual scars on her scalp, partially hidden by her hair but visible during washing and brushing. The scars formed a pattern that suggested some kind of deliberate procedure rather than accidental injury. When questioned about them, Mary showed no memory of how they had been acquired, stating simply that she remembered nothing about her time at the convent except praying very hard to become a better woman. Similar transformations occurred with increasing frequency as the convent's reputation spread throughout New England. Hannah Morse, sent for treatment of melancholia following the death of her infant son, returned home after 3 months as an unnaturally cheerful woman who claimed to have no memory of ever having a child. When shown the baby's clothing and toys, she displayed no recognition or emotional response, as if that entire chapter of her life had been completely erased from her memory. Elizabeth Thornton's case was perhaps the most disturbing. The merchant's wife had been committed to the convent for hysteria after publicly accusing her husband of adultery and demanding a divorce, scandalous behavior that threatened both families' social standing. When she returned after 4 months of treatment, she not only retracted her accusations but insisted she had never made them. More troubling still, she seemed to have no memory of the events that had led to her commitment, describing her marriage as perfectly happy and her husband as beyond reproach. Elizabeth's physical condition was also concerning. She complained of severe headaches that left her bedridden for days at a time, and family members noticed that she often seemed confused about basic information, forgetting the names of longtime friends, becoming lost in familiar neighborhoods, and struggling with simple tasks that had once been second nature to her. Like the other reformed women, she bore mysterious scars on her scalp and claimed no memory of how they had been acquired. Dr. Hartwell continued his enthusiastic endorsement of the Ashford methods, though his own behavior grew increasingly erratic as the years passed. The once respected physician began drinking heavily and often spoke in rambling monologues about advancing medical science and necessary sacrifices for the greater good of humanity. His journal entries from this period, discovered after his death, reveal a man wrestling with his conscience while justifying increasingly horrific actions. The procedures I have witnessed challenge every principle of medical ethics I was taught, yet the results are undeniable. The sisters have achieved what European physicians only theorize about: the ability to alter personality, suppress specific memories, and modify behavior through direct surgical intervention in the brain. Their documentation is meticulous, their methodology sound, their results consistent and reproducible. History will judge whether we are pioneers advancing human knowledge or monsters exploiting human suffering. The flow of correspondence between the convent and various European medical institutions intensified dramatically during this period. Local postal workers, though sworn to confidentiality through generous payments, couldn't help but notice the volume of packages and letters bearing foreign addresses. The Ashford sisters were receiving regular shipments of medical texts, surgical instruments, and chemical compounds, while sending out detailed reports and what appeared to be preserved biological specimens. Mother Superior Agatha began making monthly trips to Portland and Boston, always returning with crates of supplies and equipment that required careful handling. She explained to curious locals that the convent was pioneering revolutionary treatments for feminine mental disorders, combining traditional spiritual healing with the latest advances in European medical science. Her cultured manner and obvious education made these explanations seem plausible to a community that valued both religious faith and scientific progress. But some residents remained deeply suspicious of the changes they observed in the convent's patients. Martha Goodwin, whose daughter Rebecca had undergone treatment and returned fundamentally altered, began quietly questioning other families about their experiences. She discovered a disturbing pattern. None of the women who had received intensive treatment in the basement facilities could remember anything about their time at the convent except fragments of prayers and religious instruction. Martha's investigation revealed another troubling fact. Several women had simply never returned from the convent at all. When families inquired about their missing daughters or wives, the Ashford sisters claimed these women had experienced such profound spiritual awakening that they had chosen to remain as permanent residents, dedicating their lives to prayer and service. However, families who requested to visit these supposed residents were politely but firmly turned away, told that the women had taken strict vows of silence and seclusion that prohibited any contact with their former lives. The mystery deepened when Martha learned that the convent was accepting women from increasingly distant locations. Wealthy families from New York, Philadelphia, and even Charleston were sending their most problematic daughters to the remote Maine institution, apparently willing to pay substantial sums and travel great distances for the promise of complete behavioral transformation. The fees had risen accordingly. The sisters now charged up to $500 for what they termed comprehensive reformation, a process that typically required 6 months and guaranteed permanent elimination of all undesirable traits and tendencies. As the convent entered its second decade of operation, the Ashford sisters had established themselves as recognized authorities on feminine mental disorders throughout the medical communities of both America and Europe. Their carefully crafted reputation attracted attention from some of the most prominent physicians and researchers of the era, men who were fascinated by the detailed case studies and remarkable success rates documented in the sisters' regular correspondence with medical institutions. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore of Harvard Medical School became one of their most dedicated correspondents, maintaining a regular exchange of letters that lasted for over 15 years. In his communications, preserved in the Harvard archives, he expressed amazement at the sophistication of their research. "Your documentation of behavioral modification techniques surpasses anything I have encountered in contemporary European literature. The precision with which you correlate specific physical interventions with predictable personality changes suggests a level of understanding that our profession will not achieve for decades." What Dr. Whitmore didn't realize was that he was reading clinical descriptions of procedures that would later be recognized as primitive forms of lobotomy, trepanation, and systematic brain damage. The Ashford sisters had developed a sophisticated understanding of cranial anatomy and brain function through years of unrestricted experimentation on human subjects, accumulating knowledge that legitimate researchers could only theorize about, based on animal studies and post-mortem examinations. The sisters' research methodology was disturbingly thorough. They maintained detailed records of each patient's personality traits, behavioral patterns, and psychological characteristics before treatment, then documented every aspect of their experimental procedures with scientific precision. Post-treatment observations tracked changes in memory, personality, cognitive function, and behavior, with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized legitimate medical research. Their surgical techniques evolved significantly during this period. Sister Prudence had become remarkably skilled at what she termed targeted cranial intervention, developing methods for accessing specific regions of the brain through carefully calculated entry points. Her detailed anatomical drawings, discovered decades later, showed various approaches to different brain structures with precise measurements and angles that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of cranial anatomy. The procedures themselves were conducted with clinical detachment that made them even more horrifying. Patients were typically sedated with laudanum or other opiates, but not enough to eliminate consciousness entirely. The sisters needed their subjects to remain responsive so they could monitor the effects of their interventions in real time. They would ask questions, give commands, and observe changes in behavior as they manipulated different brain regions with their instruments. Novice Temperance had evolved into the group's expert on what they called psychological conditioning and behavioral reconstruction. She developed elaborate protocols for reinforcing the effects of surgical procedures through carefully designed programs of reward and punishment, sensory manipulation, and psychological pressure. Her methods included controlled nutrition, sleep deprivation, temperature extremes, and social isolation, all calibrated to break down existing personality structures and rebuild them according to desired specifications. The sisters also pioneered the use of various chemical compounds to enhance their experimental results. Through their network of medical contacts, they obtained access to substances that wouldn't be available to mainstream medicine for decades. They experimented with different drug combinations, documenting their effects on consciousness, memory, and susceptibility to psychological manipulation with the same systematic approach they brought to their surgical work. By 1815, the convent had processed over 400 women through their various treatment programs. The sisters maintained detailed statistical records showing success rates that exceeded 90%, though their definition of success was the complete elimination of whatever personality traits or behaviors had prompted a patient's commitment to their care. Women who died during treatment were recorded as failures and their bodies preserved for further study. The scope of their operations expanded dramatically during this period. They began accepting what they termed research volunteers, typically destitute women with no family connections who were offered food, shelter, and modest compensation in exchange for participating in experimental treatments designed to advance medical understanding of the feminine mind. These women, often prostitutes, vagrants, or widows with no means of support, provided the sisters with test subjects for their most experimental procedures. The documentation from these experiments, later discovered in hidden archives throughout the convent, reveals a systematic approach to human experimentation that was both methodical and horrifying. The sisters recorded precise measurements of skull dimensions, detailed descriptions of brain tissue reactions to various stimuli, and careful observations of the relationship between specific surgical interventions and behavioral changes. They also maintained extensive correspondence with researchers throughout Europe and America, selling their findings to medical institutions that were unable or unwilling to conduct such studies themselves. The letters reveal a thriving black market in human experimentation data, with the Ashford sisters serving as primary suppliers of information that couldn't be obtained through legitimate research methods. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna became one of their most lucrative customers, paying substantial sums for detailed documentation of personality modification through surgical intervention. His letters, intercepted decades later by authorities, specifically requested information about procedures for eliminating specific memories, reducing emotional responsiveness, and creating what he termed compliant behavioral states in female subjects. The University of Edinburgh, ironically the same institution that had expelled Dr. Agatha Brennan years earlier, unknowingly purchased research data from their former colleague through intermediaries who didn't reveal the true source of the information. The university's medical school incorporated the Ashford findings into their curriculum, teaching surgical techniques and psychological theories that were based on systematic human experimentation conducted in the Maine wilderness. Perhaps most chilling of all, the sisters began accepting commissions for specific types of behavioral modification. Wealthy families could request particular personality changes in their problematic relatives, eliminating artistic interests, reducing intellectual curiosity, suppressing romantic attachments, or creating perfect domestic compliance. The sisters developed specialized procedures for each type of modification, charging premium prices for their increasingly sophisticated services. The careful facade that had protected the Ashford sisters for nearly 2 decades began to show its first serious cracks in the winter of 1818, when a young woman named Sarah Whitman arrived at the convent under circumstances that would ultimately prove to be their undoing. Unlike the broken, desperate women who typically sought the sisters' help, Sarah came as a fighter, possessed of an intelligence and strength of will that had not been crushed by the social pressures that usually preceded commitment to the institution. Sarah's crime was having given birth to a child out of wedlock and steadfastly refusing to reveal the father's identity, despite months of pressure from her wealthy Boston family. Her parents, prominent merchants with a reputation to protect, had initially attempted to arrange a discreet marriage or adoption that would preserve family honor. When Sarah rejected both options, insisting on her right to keep her child and live independently, they declared her mentally unstable and arranged for her commitment to the Convent of Eternal Tears. At 24, Sarah possessed a formidable intellect that had been nurtured by progressive parents until her pregnancy made her an embarrassment. She had received an unusually comprehensive education for a woman of her era, including exposure to medical texts through her father's connections with Boston physicians. This background gave her knowledge that would prove crucial to recognizing the true nature of the Ashford sisters' activities. From the moment of her arrival, Sarah understood that the convent was not what it appeared to be. The other residents moved with the mechanical precision of people whose personalities had been fundamentally altered. their responses unnaturally controlled and their eyes disturbingly vacant. Many bore visible scars on their scalps, partially concealed by hair that had been allowed to grow back over surgical sites. Most telling of all, several women displayed clear symptoms of brain damage, difficulty with speech, memory problems, and personality changes so dramatic they seemed like entirely different people. Sarah's medical knowledge allowed her to recognize these symptoms for what they were, the results of deliberate surgical intervention in the brain. During her first week at the convent, she was subjected to the same preliminary examinations that preceded all intensive treatments, detailed measurements of her skull, extensive questioning about her personality traits and behaviors, and physical tests that seemed designed to map her neurological responses rather than assess her spiritual condition. The Ashford sisters were initially puzzled by Sarah's resistance to their standard conditioning procedures. Most patients, already broken by social shame and family rejection, quickly submitted to the convent's authority structure. Sarah, however, maintained her defiance even under increasingly harsh treatment, designed to break down her psychological defenses and prepare her for more intensive intervention. She was placed in solitary confinement for days at a time, denied adequate food and water, and subjected to hours of psychological abuse designed to destroy her sense of self-worth. Sister Temperance, the convent's expert in behavioral conditioning, employed every technique in her arsenal to break Sarah's will. Sensory deprivation, temperature extremes, sleep disruption, and constant verbal assault on her character and worth as a human being. Through it all, Sarah remained alert and determined to escape. She used her time in isolation to mentally map the convent's layout, memorize the sisters' routines, and plan her eventual flight to freedom. More importantly, she began documenting her observations in a makeshift journal written on scraps of paper with ink made from berry juice and hidden in the seams of her clothing. Sarah's breakthrough came during a violent thunderstorm in March 1819, when flooding in the basement disrupted the convent's normal operations. The sisters were forced to relocate equipment and patients to higher floors, creating confusion that gave Sarah the opportunity she had been waiting for. In the chaos of moving materials and managing crisis, she slipped away from her guards and began exploring areas of the building that were normally strictly forbidden to patients. What she discovered in the basement chambers exceeded her worst fears. The flooded rooms contained evidence of procedures that defied comprehension. Operating tables equipped with restraints designed to immobilize patients completely. Collections of surgical instruments unlike anything used in conventional medicine. And most horrifying of all, preserved specimens of human brain tissue floating in glass jars, each carefully labeled with patient names, dates, and procedural notes. The surgical records she found documented procedures that she recognized as deliberate, brain damage inflicted with scientific precision. The notes described the systematic removal of brain tissue from specific regions, with careful observations about resulting changes in personality, memory, and behavior. Some entries included detailed sketches of opened skulls and anatomical diagrams showing the precise locations of surgical interventions. Most damning of all, Sarah discovered extensive correspondence files containing letters from European physicians who were purchasing the sisters' research data for substantial sums of money. The letters discussed the acquisition of experimental results and anatomical specimens with the casual indifference of commercial transactions. It became clear that the convent was operating as a business enterprise, selling the results of human experimentation to researchers who were unwilling or unable to conduct such studies themselves. Armed with this knowledge and samples of documentation that she managed to conceal on her person, Sarah began planning her escape with desperate urgency. She knew that she was scheduled for intensive treatment within days, and she understood that this would likely leave her as damaged as the other women she had observed. Her window of opportunity was closing rapidly, and the sisters were becoming increasingly suspicious of her continued resistance to their conditioning methods. The escape attempt came on a moonless night in early April 1819, when Sarah managed to overpower a guard and flee into the surrounding forest. The Ashford sisters immediately organized a massive search effort, knowing that Sarah possessed information that could destroy their carefully constructed facade and expose decades of criminal activity. For 3 harrowing days, she evaded capture, while making her way through the wilderness toward the nearest settlement, surviving on spring water and whatever edible plants she could identify. The sisters' pursuit was relentless and well organized. They knew the terrain intimately and had the resources to mount a comprehensive manhunt that included local men who had been hired under the pretense of searching for a mentally disturbed woman who might harm herself. Sarah could hear her pursuers throughout her flight, their calls echoing through the forest as they systematically searched every possible hiding place. On the second night of her escape, Sarah was nearly recaptured when she stumbled into a search party while seeking shelter from a sudden rainstorm. Only quick thinking and intimate knowledge of the forest, gained during childhood visits to her grandfather's logging camp, allowed her to evade detection. She spent the remainder of the night hiding in a fallen tree, listening to her pursuers search the area around her hiding place. Just when we thought the horrors of the Maine wilderness couldn't get worse, Sarah's desperate flight through the forest intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens when Sarah finally reaches civilization and the shocking truth begins to unravel. By the 3rd day, Sarah's physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. She was dehydrated, exhausted, and suffering from exposure to the harsh April weather. Her feet were bleeding from walking barefoot over rough terrain, and she was beginning to show signs of hypothermia. But her determination to reach safety and expose the Ashford sisters' crimes drove her forward, despite her body's protests. The breakthrough came when she encountered a trapper named Joshua Meadows, who was checking his lines in the early morning hours. Initially suspicious of this wild-looking woman emerging from the forest, Joshua's attitude changed dramatically when Sarah began describing specific details about the convent that only someone with inside knowledge could know. Her desperation was genuine, her injuries were real, and her story was too detailed and consistent to be the product of mental illness. Joshua provided Sarah with food, warm clothing, and most importantly, safe passage to the sheriff's office in Millbridge. But even as they traveled together, Sarah remained terrified that the Ashford sisters would find her before she could tell her story to authorities. She had seen enough of their operations to know that they had resources and connections that extended far beyond their isolated convent. When Sarah Whitman finally reached Sheriff William Hawthorne's office in Millbridge on April 18, 1819, her appearance and wild claims initially met with the same skepticism that had greeted Thomas Brewster's account 16 years earlier. Sheriff Hawthorne, a practical man who prided himself on level-headed judgment, assumed he was confronting another victim of wilderness exposure and mental breakdown. Sarah's story of systematic human experimentation seemed too fantastic to be credible, too horrific to be real. However, several factors distinguished Sarah's testimony from typical accounts of disturbed individuals. First, her detailed knowledge of the convent's interior layout matched information that had never been made public. She could describe not only the general structure of the building, but specific details about the basement chambers, the arrangement of equipment, and the locations of hidden storage areas that only someone with extensive inside access could know. More importantly, Sarah had managed to steal several crucial documents during her escape. Surgical notes, correspondence with European medical institutions, and patient records that provided concrete evidence of the Ashford sisters' activities. These documents, written in clinical language but describing procedures that would be considered war crimes by modern standards, left no doubt about the systematic nature of the horrors being conducted at the convent. The first document was a surgical log covering procedures performed on 23 different women over the course of 8 months. The entries were written with scientific precision, documenting operations that involved drilling holes in patients' skulls and inserting various implements to damage or remove specific brain tissues. Each entry included detailed pre-operative personality assessments, surgical notes describing the exact procedures performed, and post-operative observations tracking changes in behavior, memory, and cognitive function. One particularly chilling entry described the case of Margaret Fowler, a 19-year-old woman who had been committed for excessive reading and intellectual curiosity inappropriate to her sex. The surgical notes documented a procedure designed to damage the brain regions associated with learning and memory, with the stated goal of reducing patients' compulsive interest in books and abstract thinking while preserving basic domestic skills. The post-operative observations showed the horrific success of the procedure. Margaret's personality had been fundamentally altered. Her love of reading was completely eliminated, her vocabulary was dramatically reduced, and her ability to engage in complex reasoning was severely impaired. The notes concluded with satisfaction that patient now displays appropriate feminine docility and shows no interest in activities beyond basic household tasks. The second document was even more damning, a detailed correspondence file containing letters from Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna, negotiating the purchase of cranial intervention research data for the sum of 4,000 Austrian florins. The letters specifically requested documentation of techniques for eliminating undesired memories and personality traits through surgical modification of brain structure. Dr. Zimmermann's correspondence revealed the existence of an international network of researchers who were purchasing human experimentation data from the Ashford sisters. Universities in Edinburgh, Berlin, and Paris were all receiving regular reports detailing the results of procedures that would be banned under any civilized legal system. The sisters were essentially operating as commercial suppliers of information that legitimate researchers couldn't obtain through ethical means. The third document was perhaps the most horrifying, a patient catalogue listing over 600 women who had been processed through the convent's various programs since 1798. The catalogue was organized by type of treatment received, with detailed annotations describing the specific procedures performed on each patient and their ultimate disposition. The majority of entries were marked reformed and returned, women who had undergone surgical modification and been sent back to their families with altered personalities. A smaller number were listed as permanent residents, women who had supposedly chosen to remain at the convent but whose current whereabouts were unspecified. Most troubling of all, nearly 200 entries were marked simply as expired, women who had died during or shortly after experimental procedures. Sheriff Hawthorne, confronted with this overwhelming evidence, realized he was dealing with crimes that exceeded anything in his experience. He immediately organized a raid on the convent, assembling a force of 15 armed men for what he now understood would be far more than a routine arrest. The sheriff also sent urgent messages to authorities in Portland and Boston, requesting assistance from federal marshals who would have jurisdiction over crimes of this magnitude. However, the Ashford sisters had been monitoring the situation through their network of informants in Millbridge. By the time the raiding party reached the convent on the morning of May 20th, 1819, they found the building completely abandoned. The sisters had vanished during the night, taking with them most of their portable equipment and documentation, leaving behind only the evidence they couldn't transport. The search of the abandoned convent revealed a chamber of horrors that traumatized even the most hardened members of the raiding party. The basement contained a fully equipped surgical theater with implements specifically designed for cranial procedures. The walls were lined with shelves holding hundreds of preserved brain specimens, each labeled with detailed information about the patient from whom it had been removed and the specific experiments that had been conducted. A hidden chamber behind. A false wall contained 47 bodies in various states of preservation, all showing evidence of cranial surgery. The bodies had been maintained in a solution of alcohol and other chemicals, apparently for ongoing study purposes. Each corpse was tagged with detailed information about the procedures that had been performed and the results that had been achieved before death. The investigators also discovered extensive documentation that had been left behind in the sisters' hasty departure. File cabinets contained thousands of pages of surgical notes, patient records, and correspondence with medical institutions throughout the world. The scope of the operation was staggering. The sisters had been conducting systematic human experimentation for over 20 years, documenting procedures that wouldn't be recognized by mainstream medicine for decades. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, when confronted with evidence of his complicity in the operation, initially attempted to justify his involvement by claiming he was advancing medical science for the benefit of humanity. These women were already lost to society, he argued desperately. Their conditions made them unsuitable for normal life. At least their suffering contributed to knowledge that will help future generations. However, when presented with the full scope of the experimentation and the evidence of systematic murder disguised as medical treatment, Dr. Hartwell suffered what appeared to be a complete mental breakdown. In his final confession, delivered while under guard in the Millbridge jail, he revealed the true identities of the Ashford sisters and the full extent of their criminal background. The women known as Mother Superior Agatha, Sister Prudence, and Novice Temperance Ashford were actually Dr. Agatha Brennan, Dr. Prudence Ashford, and Dr. Temperance Ashford, trained physicians who had been expelled from European medical institutions for conducting unauthorized human experiments. Dr. Brennan had been banned from practicing medicine in Scotland after several patients died during her experimental procedures designed to correct feminine hysteria through surgical intervention. Dr. Prudence Ashford had been dismissed from the University of Edinburgh Medical School after being caught conducting illegal experiments on asylum patients, attempting to map brain function through systematic damage to different cranial regions. Dr. Temperance Ashford, the youngest of the three, had been her sister's student in developing psychological conditioning techniques designed to enhance the effects of surgical procedures. The three women had fled Europe in 1797 and established their false identity as Anglican nuns to provide cover for continuing their research in a location where they would be free from medical oversight or legal constraints. They had spent over 20 years perfecting techniques for modifying human behavior through surgical intervention, accumulating knowledge that legitimate researchers could only dream of obtaining. The manhunt for the escaped Ashford sisters became one of the most extensive criminal investigations in early American history, involving federal marshals, local sheriffs, and even international cooperation with European authorities. However, the three women had vanished completely, leaving behind only the horrific evidence of their 2 decades of systematic human experimentation. Investigation revealed that the sisters had maintained multiple escape routes from the convent and had accumulated substantial wealth from their illegal activities. Bank records discovered during the investigation showed they had transferred enormous sums to accounts in Canada, Mexico, and several European countries over the years. The total amount exceeded $50,000, a fortune that would be worth millions in today's currency. The sisters had also established false identities and safe houses throughout North America and Europe, suggesting they had planned their eventual escape from the beginning of their American operations. Shipping records indicated they had been gradually moving equipment and documentation out of the convent for months before Sarah's escape, preparing for the possibility that their activities would eventually be discovered. The investigation revealed the full scope of their criminal enterprise. Over the course of 21 years, the Ashford sisters had processed more than 600 women through their experimental programs. Of these, approximately 250 had been returned to their families as successfully treated patients, though investigation revealed that all showed signs of brain damage consistent with surgical intervention. Another 150 women had been reported as choosing to remain at the convent as permanent residents, though no trace of these women was ever found. The sisters had apparently murdered these patients when their conditions made them unsuitable for return to society, preserving their bodies for ongoing study and disposing of the remains when preservation was no longer useful. The remaining 200 women were found in various states of preservation throughout the convent's hidden chambers. These appeared to be patients who had died during experimental procedures or had been deliberately killed when their responses to treatment provided valuable research data. The systematic preservation of these bodies suggested they had been maintained for comparative study over extended periods. The investigation also uncovered evidence of an extensive network of collaborators throughout the medical and academic communities. Dr. Hartwell was only one of several physicians who had referred patients to the convent and provided medical supplies in exchange for access to experimental results. Postal workers, suppliers, and even some local officials had been paid to maintain secrecy about the convent's activities. Universities throughout America and Europe were found to have unknowingly incorporated the Ashford sisters' research into their medical curricula. Surgical techniques and psychological theories that were being taught to new generations of physicians were based on systematic human experimentation conducted in the Maine wilderness. The discovery forced a painful re-examination of the sources of medical knowledge and the ethical standards of the profession. The families of victims faced an agonizing choice between seeking justice and protecting their reputations. Public acknowledgement that their daughters and wives had been subjected to horrific experimentation would expose them to social scandal and destroy their standing in their communities. Most chose silence, preferring to live with private grief rather than public shame. This conspiracy of silence meant that the full extent of the Ashford sisters' crimes was never officially acknowledged. The investigation was quietly closed after 6 months, with most of the evidence sealed in government archives that wouldn't be opened for over a century. The official record simply stated that 3 women operating a fraudulent medical facility had fled justice, leaving behind evidence of irregular treatment methods. The convent building was eventually burned to the ground by local residents who wanted to erase all trace of what had occurred there. However, the extensive documentation of the sisters' experiments was preserved and eventually made its way to medical institutions throughout the world. Ironically, research that had been obtained through such horrific means contributed to legitimate advances in understanding brain function and psychological disorders. Sarah Whitman, the sole survivor to escape and expose the truth, struggled for years with the trauma of her experience. She spent months providing testimony to investigators and helping to identify other victims, but the emotional toll was devastating. The knowledge that she was the only person willing to speak publicly about the horrors she had witnessed isolated her from a society that preferred to forget such uncomfortable truths. Sarah eventually moved to California under an assumed name, where she worked as a teacher while trying to rebuild her life. She never married and maintained minimal contact with her family, who were embarrassed by her public testimony about the convent. Her detailed memoir, written shortly before her death in 1863, provided the most complete account of life inside the Convent of Eternal Tears and served as crucial historical evidence of the sisters' crimes. The Ashford sisters themselves were never captured, though unconfirmed reports placed them in various locations throughout the Americas and Europe over the following decades. Some investigators believed they continued their work under different identities, while others suggested they had been killed by associates seeking to eliminate witnesses to their crimes. A reported sighting in Argentina in 1847 described 3 elderly women operating a private medical facility for wealthy families, but investigation proved inconclusive. The most credible account came from a French physician who claimed to have encountered Dr. Agatha Brennan in Paris in 1856. According to his report, she was working under an assumed name as a private physician specializing in nervous disorders in women, using techniques that bore suspicious similarities to the methods documented at the Maine convent. However, when authorities investigated, the woman had already disappeared, leaving behind only tantalizing hints of her true identity. The case of the Convent of Eternal Tears represents one of the most systematic and prolonged examples of human experimentation in American history. The Ashford sisters combined scientific methodology with complete moral bankruptcy, creating a program of research that advanced medical knowledge while destroying hundreds of lives. Their meticulous documentation revealed techniques and insights that wouldn't be officially recognized by mainstream medicine for decades, but at a human cost that defies comprehension. The case also exposed the vulnerability of women in early American society, where social pressures and legal constraints made it possible for 3 criminals to operate with impunity for over 2 decades. The systematic exploitation of society's most vulnerable members, justified by claims of medical progress and social benefit, reveals how easily noble intentions can mask horrific crimes. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the conspiracy of silence that followed the sisters' exposure demonstrated society's willingness to suppress uncomfortable truths rather than confront the implications of systematic abuse. The families, medical institutions, and government officials who chose secrecy over justice ensured that the victim's suffering would be forgotten and that similar crimes might occur again. This mystery shows us the terrifying potential of unchecked scientific ambition combined with social prejudice against vulnerable populations. The fact that 3 women could operate a systematic program of human experimentation for over 2 decades, with the tacit support of medical professionals and community leaders, reveals how dangerous knowledge can become when pursued without moral constraints or ethical oversight. What do you think of this story? Could such systematic horrors really have remained hidden for so long in early American society? The evidence suggests that the pursuit of knowledge, when divorced from human compassion and ethical responsibility, can lead to atrocities that challenge our understanding of civilized behavior. Do you believe that similar crimes could occur today, hidden behind facades of respectability and scientific progress? Leave your comment below with your thoughts on this chilling chapter of American history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark mysteries like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves uncovering the buried secrets of our past. The shadows of history hold many more truths that powerful people try to erase forever. See you in the next video, where we'll reveal another dark secret that challenges everything we thought we knew about American history.